So I'm not going to talk about research at all. I'm going to talk about a conceptualisation. So at the moment, there's a group of us, probably a sort of I wouldn't say a growing number, but a coalescence of vegans within criminology who are particularly finding one another because of the development of a subdiscipline known as green criminology, which I'll say a little bit about. And that has led us to start to think about, is there a space for a vegan criminology? What would that look like? What might it cover? Or do we need vegan voices within criminology? Is that something a little bit different? So these are the kind of things that we're grappling with. We've started to think about some of these things separately, and now eventually we've sort of started talking to one another, and there's a group of us coming together that are starting to think about some of these things. So in this talk today, I'm going to say a bit about what vegan criminology is. It isn't there yet, it doesn't exist, but what it could be, what it might be, what we might want it to be. So some initial thoughts and ideas, and I'm also going to talk about some findings from a presentation I did on the same topic at the British Society of Criminology conference last summer, where I ran a workshop on vegan criminology and asked attendees what they thought vegan criminology might be, what it might look like, and what kind of things might we cover. Then I will summarise Kay's contribution based upon her book chapter on veganising green criminology, and then I'll hand over to Matthew, who's going to talk about approaching vegan criminology as a sociologist, and particularly talk about some of the learning tools that he's been using to actually advance vegan criminology. So first of all, what is vegan criminology and what could it be? So, veganism in academia, and I get to name-check a few people who are in the room as well today and who I've seen talking previously. Veganism in academia seems to be a growing area, so not least the fact that we now have a text, a handbook of vegan studies, but also we're seeing sort of vegan geographies, vegan sociology and so forth as well. So there's this kind of growing interest within academia for taking an animal turn. And it's not new, but seeing the term vegan used around these areas is certainly newer. I am well aware as well that obviously there's a lot of discourse that will have taken place that overlaps with vegan criminology, particularly within sociology and critical animal studies. That's not my area, so I'm really focusing on criminology today. So within criminology, there are lots and lots of areas where veganism might be relevant. And one of the things that's different about the talk that we're doing now compared to some of the ones we've seen previously is this is very much focused on the harm that's caused to animals by us not being vegan and the things that we do because of the way we treat animals as property and as objects. So it's a slightly different take, although I will go back to vegans as in our experiences and why it's relevant for humans as well. So we could explore the harms to non-human animals from a vegan standpoint in lots and lots of different sort of subdisciplines of criminology. Green criminology is the most obvious, and then animal victimology as well. So these are the two that really stand out. But we could talk about it from a southern criminological perspective, from sort of a decolonisation perspective. We can obviously talk about it in terms of things like intersectionality, which we've talked about previously, and ecofeminism. It can come up in white-collar and corporate crime because of the sort of the corporations exploiting animals, state crime similarly as well, transnational and organised crime if we think about things like illegal wildlife trafficking and the implications for non-human animal harm, terrorism and extremist studies because we may see vegan activist groups being labelled as extremist and their activities and the sort of responses that we might face from policing. Obviously, we can talk about violence in terms of violence to non-human animals, hate crime, particularly towards humans who are vegans, but also we might think about the way we treat non-human animals as a form of hate crime as well. And then we can also think about things like sort of the criminal justice system and animals' place within that, which overlaps with some of the other areas as well. And then if we really sort of stretch the boundaries, we can think about war as being having an overlap with criminology, transitional justice and post-conflict society, and then semiology. So I'm just going to tell you about a couple of key areas within criminology before I move on. So green criminology is, in very simple terms, a branch of criminology that looks at harms to the environment, non-human animals and humanity. And it sort of developed in the sort of mid to late 90s, and it's really kind of taken off within criminology at the moment. And this is where a lot of work around non-human animal harm tends to sit, although it's dominated by a focus on the environment and climate. So this is how a lot of us have managed to find each other, because we're green criminologists and then happen to be a sort of a critical mass of vegans in that group as well. Animal victimology is an area of research that I've developed over the last few years. The initial paper was written with Matthew Hall in 2017, and this is about the idea of victimology as a study within criminology of the victim-centred focus. So what happens to victims? What are their relationships with their offenders? How does the criminal justice system treat them? What are their experiences? How do we give victims voice? How do we centre them in terms of the criminal experience? And my argument is that victimology is anthropocentric. It's ignored animals as victims from both very legalistic perspectives, because animals within law are generally not seen as beings, as victims. They can't hold that status within the criminal justice system, but also in terms of research, and we just don't know much about the experience of animal victimisation. And anybody that was here 2 years ago at the previous one, this is what I talked about. I talked about animal victimology. So there's a clear overlap between this area and the area of vegan criminology. And then semiology is also important, so I just need to mention this one as well. So within criminology, you might be thinking, yeah, but it's not crime, is it? The things that happen to animals, much of it isn't crime. Semiology is an approach that takes a social harm perspective, so it's a more critical branch of criminology, and it doesn't see crime as things that are just labelled as crime by the state, because if we do that, it will limit to only those things that the state is concerned about, or those in power are able to influence that label is attached to them. So much of criminology looks at things beyond crime. It looks at what we might refer to as social harms. So we're not precluded from studying animals as victims. We're not precluded from studying factory farming as a form of crime just because it isn't actually something that's illegal. So vegan criminology has the ability to study a whole range of things that might actually be relevant in terms of veganism. But none of these areas are certainly not exclusively conceptualised through a vegan lens, and at best, most of them marginalise non-human animals. So you pick up most criminology textbooks and you'll see no mention of animals at all, particularly in terms of victimisation. There are some areas that I've labelled kind of vegan-ish criminology because they're kind of moving in that direction, but they're certainly not vegan criminology yet. So there have been some attempts, particularly Ken Mentor in the US, and more recently a text, an edited collection on violence in the animal industrial complex, which Richard Twine's been involved in as well. There's anti-speciesist scholarship clearly taking place within criminology. So there's the work of people like Solond, Wyatt, Mayer, etc. And you see some examples of using alternative language to talk about harm to animals within this literature as well. For example, talking about kidnapping in illegal wildlife trade. We talk about abduction now instead of dog theft, for example. And you also see the term theriacide used in terms of the killing of animals. Within green criminology, where we might expect to find the most sort of vegan elements, there is some, although there's very little. Notably, Kay's work about veganising green criminology, but it will maybe surprise you to know that many, many green criminologists are not vegan. So you go to a green criminology event and you expect it's going to be like this, and there's going to be the vegan platter there, and there isn't. There's like your little vegan plate, and then there's still all the meat and things at the side of it. It's surprising how many people who identify as green criminologists aren't vegan. So, you know, there's a space for us to develop this. Animal victimology, which I've already mentioned, work on teaching vegan criminology, which Matthew's going to talk about in a moment, and then also another one of our sort of collaborators, Stacey Banwell, who's been doing a lot of work around the war against non-human animals, and particularly focusing on reproductive violence against animals in the animal industrial complex. So why vegan criminology? And I had to keep asking myself the question as well, so I kind of go back, I have to defend it, because a lot of people say, what have those two things got to do with each other? So I went back to the definition of what vegan is. So using the Vegan Society definition, you'll all be familiar with this. It's a way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as possible and practicable, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose. And by extension, etc., etc. And it's the or any other purpose where I've kind of added the emphasis. So it isn't necessarily about diet, although diet features. It isn't necessarily about sort of using animals for food. But as vegans, is there not a moral imperative to think about how that veganism plays out in all aspects of our life, including our academic research? So as a vegan, when I think about criminology, I think about the criminal justice system and how it works. And I think about prisoners and what diets they have access to. and I think about what happens to animals who are being factory farmed at the moment, this chimes with my understanding of the things that we label as crime and the ways that we respond to them. So I see that vegan criminology is certainly something that could kind of fit within this label. So some early ideas for vegan criminology, and it's very much just a mind dump that I came up with a sort of year or so ago. Veganism is not just about focusing on diet and household provisions, but all forms of behaviour that result in animal consumption, exploitation or cruelty. So there are clearly going to be these things taking place within the criminal justice system, and these behaviours are clearly going to produce social harm if we take a vegan perspective. So therefore, vegan criminology should be considering the effects of policies and practices, particularly amongst the public sector and state organisations. So, for example, when laws are passed or things are criminalised, what are the potential implications for non-human animals or for vegans? Responses to crime and victimisation, what are the implications of those? It also needs to look at how the systems around crime, all of the sort of complex that's built up around crime, responds to vegans, vegan activism, particularly in relation to how they're viewed in the law, the harms that they might experience, that we might experience as vegans, and how we're responded to, for example, being labelled as extremist and sort of having anti-terror legislation potentially used against us whilst we're engaging in activism and protest. Obviously, there are areas of corporate harm that need to be explored, and that's a sort of real strong area within critical criminology. And then the policy and practices that have an indirect effect on non-human animals. And I'll pick up a couple of examples in a moment. In keeping with critical and green criminologies, we need to adopt a social harm perspective, and institutional speciesism should be challenged. So just as we've recognised institutional racism and sexism within the police, for example, we need to look at the institutions of the criminal justice system and recognise that they are also inherently speciesist as well. And of course, intersectionality needs to be recognised. So here's a very mainstream example. I'll try and keep it as quick as possible. So I've done some work on the illegal wildlife trade several years ago, and there's a real concern about endangered species and needing to control wildlife trade in order to prevent extinction. So we have offences that are created that make it illegal to trade in particular species or to trade outside of quotas in those species. There's a real conservation imperative here. It's about conserving the species of endangered animals and trying to prevent that taking place. But this is also happening within the context of a perfectly legal wildlife trade. So conservation isn't actually about the harm that's caused to these animals, it's actually about the harm that's caused to the wider population. So there's kind of a real sort of focus on sort of population statistics, not the suffering of the animal that is being hunted, that's being killed, that's being crammed into a plastic bottle to put in a suitcase to be able to ship to be sold in a bird market, for example. So in my research in this area, many of the responses talked about sort of kind of these economic models of response. So for example, if you want to stop tiger bone trade, you could start farming tigers. Then tigers in the wild would be protected, and therefore we wouldn't have this sort of concern about tigers going extinct because of that trade. Now, of course, the vegan in me immediately is going, no, this is not what we should be doing at all. But from a criminological perspective, that may be very, very effective. So that's one example of why we might need to think about veganising criminology in some of our responses. And then, perhaps to us, an obvious example, but certainly a less mainstream example, so this is the one where it's a little bit more challenging to my usual audiences. We can also think about exploring the harms that are associated with agriculture, animal agriculture, through a vegan criminological lens. So, for example, we might think about those activities as these kind of examples. So these are words that come straight from criminology, straight from law. You know, imprisonment, violence and torture taking place, rape, kidnapping, murder. These sort of same activities that we were doing to animals, if we were doing them to human animals, we would be labelling them in this way. So perhaps if we took a sort of a vegan lens to look at that activity, we could start to explore it in the same way that we would if these were recognised as crimes. And addressing things like hierarchical speciesism. So we've sort of seen those examples about how we maybe try to make farmed animals appear more like animals that are companion animals to try and get people to connect with them, that hierarchical speciesism that's taking place. And of course the corporate and state-sanctioned harm and that role of power. I mean, these are things that criminologists look at all the time, but not in respect of non-human animals. Of course, vegan criminology is also for humans too, so there are areas within vegan criminology that wouldn't just be about non-human animals, but also humans. So the construction of vegan beliefs and activism being labelled as extremist, and then the subsequent police responses to that. Vegans in the criminal justice system, so for example, prisoners, employees and victims who are vegan, are their needs served? So the really obvious example I always come back to, which I think is the least contentious for a non-vegan audience, is should a vegan prisoner be able to have access to a fully vegan diet, for example? And I think there's a whole area of research that needs to be carried out there that hasn't really been done. But also employees, so if you're a police officer, for example, are you expected to wear kit that's leather? And what are the alternatives to that? So thinking about some of those kind of things. Obviously, hate crime and bullying that's targeted at vegans as well. We've seen an increase, a reported increase in hate crime towards people who are vegans. That would be another area of criminological interest. And then sort of that broader human rights kind of perspective, so that sort of human vegan rights and their marginalisation. So vegan criminology is for humans as well. I'm going to give you a whole load of questions now for you to think about, and if you want to talk to me about them and have some answers to them, then that would be great. So I ran a workshop where I basically did a sort of slightly longer version of this presentation at the British Society of Criminology conference, and then I asked the participants to get into groups and answer a whole bunch of questions. So I left them with these, there were some other things as well, but this is what I'm focusing on today. I left them with these questions about, is there a place for vegan criminology and what might it look like? So, what sort of conception of vegan should we use? We maybe have different understandings about what we mean by veganism, particularly what we mean about vegan ethics and where our ethical imperative comes from to be vegan and engage in vegan activity. And does that have a difference in terms of what we think the discipline would look like? Would the development of a subdiscipline or some kind of network of scholars be beneficial to people? Which should it be? Should there be a vegan criminology? Or should we try and get vegan criminologists together to network? Does vegan criminology have the potential to bring about positive change? Because if it doesn't, probably there's no point in doing it. So what could we actually achieve if we were to come together as vegan criminologists? What challenges or problems do you see, and why should we not develop a vegan criminology? So there's quite a lot on here, and I'm not going to talk through them all, but these were the responses that have kind of the themes that came through from the responses of that workshop. So there's some real kind of focus on the idea. In actual fact, although it looks like it's fairly even, there was more talked about the idea than there was talked about what it would actually look like. So there were questions around what do we mean by veganism, things around ethical plurality, so how do you bring people together that perhaps have got different ethical imperatives in terms of their veganism, particularly thinking about sort of non-human animal focus versus environmental concerns. What's the goal? What does it add? And I've bolded that, so I think it's really important. You might all tell me there's no point in us doing this. That's great. I want to know that. What's the point of it? What are we actually trying to achieve? The importance of a social harm perspective, making sure we've got open inquiry. There were some concerns about the optics, sort of the proselytizing vegan, and everything's got to have the vegan label attached to it now, and will people take us seriously if we identify ourselves as vegan criminologists as opposed to just criminologists, and how might that be looked at, and the challenges that we might face if we self-identify as vegan criminal. Are we vegan enough, and what's those shoes made out of, and all of those kind of challenges that we might face, and perhaps research that maybe isn't sort of firmly within that vegan area. Would we be challenged about our engagement in that kind of activity? The really good question about who can do it. So can non-vegans do vegan criminology, or do you have to be a vegan? Because, males can be feminists, and there's a kind of difficult question there around it. And people particularly saying now's a good time. If we are going to develop in this area, there's clearly a groundswell within academia, as we saw at the beginning, of people kind of started identifying vegan movements within their disciplines, and now is a good time to do it. And then we had a bunch of responses around what it might actually look like and include, and often these overlap with some of the examples that I've already given. But I tend to focus on the non-human animal thing, because that's the thing that brought me to veganism. Other respondents were saying, we really need to think about the environmental element of this as well, and climate dimensions. We need to think about migration and climate refugees and that overlap with non-human animals. We also need to think about, which is one that I have heard people talk about and I should have thought about, but I didn't think about, those people who work in the animal industrial complex, who themselves may be seen as victims of that experience of working within that industry. Things around oppression and masculinity. whether there are connections between sort of abolitionist movements and more restorative practices within criminal justice, and whether they have sort of synergies with these perhaps more sort of naturalistic approaches towards responding to these issues. And then again, that sort of issue of intersectionality, feminism and class, both as an area of inquiry, but also as an area of concern. That sort of, you know, the white saviour, it's a middle-class activity to be vegan, those kind of things, not putting our assumptions upon others, were also raised as well. So that was my bit. Then I would have got to sit down, but I don't. So I'm going to quickly run through Kay's bit. I think I've actually covered quite a bit of this, so I'll probably be able to say this relatively quickly. But this is a sort of summary of some of the arguments and the questions that Kay has raised in a chapter that she wrote for a Gender in Green Criminology book about veganising green criminology. And she sort of came to this with that sort of question about, why is there so little talk about veganism within this kind of discipline of green criminology? So, apologies if there's a slight repetition of three people bringing things together when we haven't really had a chance to sort of develop it properly. Conventional criminology focuses largely on crimes as defined by the criminal law, although it doesn't have to, as I've said. Because most non-human animal abuse is legal, we recognise that billions of non-human animal victims are being ignored, and that kind of goes back to that idea about what we're blinkered to within criminology in terms of the harms we look at and the harms that we ignore and we tend not to focus on. So much of the work within criminology that does look at non-human animals looks at things like companion animal abuse, dog theft, those kinds of things, illegal wildlife trade. It doesn't look at factory farming, it doesn't look at farming at all. We know that's where the greatest number of victims are, so this is where we need to kind of really focus our efforts. Green criminology aims to study crimes and harms affecting human and non-human life, as we've already seen, but it tends to have this sort of focus on nature as an entity and the environment more than on the individual non-human animal victim. And also recognising that much of this harm that we're talking about is actually taking place in the urban sphere. So if we focus on the environment and we focus on nature, we're actually missing a lot of harm that's just taking place in everyday urban environments through animal consumption. So in order to veganise it, Kay takes a particular sort of ethical vegan approach. So a non-anthropocentric approach that opposes the commodity status of non-human animals, contesting speciesism and ideas that there can be a humane use of non-human animals. Again, sort of chime with vegan ideas. It could also be seen potentially as a political position as well that stands against the idea of illegal and legal non-human animal suffering and death. She nicely quoted me to say that vegan criminology needs to take a species justice perspective and criminological activism could be central. So this is a really interesting point, and this is kind of nicely moves into the stuff that Matthew's now going to talk about. So there's a real tension within academia, as I'm sure many of you are aware, between sort of academia and activism and how much they should and shouldn't overlap with one another. Generally tending to come from that positivistic sort of perspective that we should be neutral, we shouldn't bring our own sort of biases to our research, and as a result of that, therefore, all we should do is discover truths and not actually go about trying to sort of change the world. That's one very particular perspective, but that tension is certainly there. Criminological activism, however, extends beyond the idea of just teaching and researching sort of social and legal justice activities and actually engaging with them as well. And Kay asked the question about whether this is actually a requirement of being an ethical vegan. So if you are an ethical vegan, is it a necessity? Are you driven? Do you have to also engage in activism through the work that you do? And for Kay, activism begins at home. So non-humans are animals, and they're victims of us all, including those of us who are criminologists. So as criminologists, we need to sort of unpick this and look at that harm that we are causing by ignoring non-human animals in our activities. And so therefore, Kay would argue that veganising green criminology starts with criminologists becoming ethical vegans. So it's a very particular kind of take on how we might approach that, which I think, again, I would leave open to question about how you feel about that. So finally, I'm going to hand over to Matthew, who's going to talk about approaching vegan criminology as a sociologist. And he's got some really interesting examples. And just to say, I'm popping back to the conclusion at the end, and the final slide has some links on from Matthew's work. You might want to take a photograph of those so that you've got them after the fact.
Okay, thanks very much, Mel. And thanks, everyone, for being here. And so this is always a bit strange for me. I always have imposter syndrome, presenting myself as a criminologist, because my background is purely in sociology. That's what my first degrees were and so on. And I kind of entered criminology really through invitation in a way, and without getting too bogged down in my autobiography, I was invited to contribute to some Open University teaching materials at the time when I was in the sociology department. And long story short, I ended up transferring into criminology from sociology, because at that time it seemed I could actually do more vegan work in the criminology department, which was kind of surprising to me at the time, but you know, increasingly it makes sense. So hopefully what I'm going to talk about will make it make sense to you as well. So the reason why I felt like I could fit is because where I'm working at the OU, there is very much this focus on social harm or semiology, as Mel was talking about a bit earlier. Very much that aspect of criminology, or critique of criminology you might say, is quite prominent. I mean, certainly not what all of my colleagues do by any means, but it certainly is prominent. And one of the most significant figures in the formation of semiology, Steve Toombs, was on my interview panel and got to be my colleague before he retired. So that's how I fitted in. And why did I fit in as a sociologist? Well, here's the definition of social harm that the OU, that my department uses in its teaching materials. So this isn't my definition, I didn't write it. A concept used to show how various social problems, including but not limited to crime, can be understood to be shaped and influenced by a broader social context and the way in which we organise society. So those are sociological questions to me straight away. So it's like, okay, this fits, this resonates with what I've been doing all along. So the way I got into teaching in my department was doing this kind of social harm approach, focusing on speciesist social structures, which is related to the research I've been doing for the last 15 years or so on my own with my partner Kate Stewart and others, which is looking into how speciesist practices and discourses construct our attitudes, our behaviours towards other animals. So we've done a lot of work looking at the socialisation process, for example, how children are brought up to believe that speciesism is normal without it ever being labelled as such, of course, and to believe that veganism is abnormal, again, often without it being labelled as such. This is the implicit flip side of being inculcated with speciesist practices and ideas. And so the inverse of that, that's either explicit or implicit in my teaching also, is that vegan social structures can subvert or invert speciesist ones. So how does that work in some examples? So, oh, and I should have said, just before I got started, I spoke a lot more at greater length than I've got time today about a lot of this stuff in an On the Pulse webinar, which I believe a recording is available on the Vegan Society website. So if you want to hear more about this, you get me for about an hour without fighting a cold, so I'll probably be more coherent as well in that recording, so please check that out. So this is the first thing I did when I joined the department, the first teaching I produced. It's a chapter for one of the textbooks on a module called Crime, Harm and the State. And my chapter is called Crime, Harm and Non-Human Animals. So what I'm doing in that chapter is several things, but I suppose the headline is I'm looking at the animal industrial complex and the massive scale of harms that it generates that are legal, that are normal, that are business as usual, generally taken for granted, generally not critiqued by society at large, and indeed by most criminologists to date. And another thing I was doing in that chapter is teaching discourse analysis as a skill for students. And that made me think earlier today, listening to a lot of these talks, it made me wonder about the extent to which we're able to use this research in our teaching. So if I'd had a chance to put my hand up, I would have asked that about pretty much everyone so far. Like, have you used this in your teaching? Could you, and maybe that's something we can talk about later. So one of the ways I do that is by using imagery in the chapter. So contrasting images of pigs in factory farms, for example, with an individualised, subjectified portrait of a pig from Isa Leshko's book, Allowed to Grow Old, which some of you might know, where she photographs formerly farmed animals who have lived into old age in vegan sanctuaries, and how different that looks to what we're used to seeing as objectified non-humans. So this chapter, this teaching material, has been converted into this free online course on OpenLearn, which is the Open University's online learning platform, available freely to everyone. So anyone, please access this, make use of it in your own teaching or outreach. I'd be very grateful if you did that. So another thing I've been able to do at the Open University is produce material directly for OpenLearn. And here's an example of that. So I've been able to create or co-produce what we've called a veganism interactive. So the idea behind this is as a form of outreach. So going back to one of Mel's questions or discussion points, I do see my teaching as part of activism, and indeed my research is part of activism. So teaching is activism for me. It is promoting veganism through criminological means, I suppose, or sociological means. So this interactive draws on that general kind of social harm perspective of looking at species as social structures as the problem and vegan social structures or vegogenic social structures as the solution. And it does that for a few reasons, but one reason is to avoid individualizing the problem and the risks of guilt tripping learners, people who come to this website, trying to avoid the problems of people feeling that they're being preached to, get away from the preachy vegan stereotype, which we've all, I'm sure, encountered. It's very tedious, but it's still very powerful. So it's focusing on structures as the issue and very much getting across the idea that all of us, whether we're vegan or not, we were born into, we were socialized into species as social structures. And we have been more or less fortunate in terms of the extent to which we've been able to encounter veganism in a positive way and not be turned off from it. But nevertheless, we've all inhabited this kind of environment. And that is the problem. It's not what we as individuals do that's the problem, it's the fact that we're stuck in this system still, despite all the progress that I think we're making. So this is how we approach it. This is a still image from an animated video that forms part of the interactive. This is based on work that I've done with Kate Stewart over many years, especially in our book, which is now 10 years old, amazingly, how time flies. So I haven't got time to talk about the detail here, but hopefully the video makes sense of it. I've heard from some colleagues that they found this very useful in their own teaching for trying to explain speciesism to undergraduate students, which can be quite difficult to get your heads around conceptually when it feels quite strange and new. So that's setting up the problem. And then the following animated video later in the interactive course is a bit of history of veganism. And again, presenting veganism as the flip side, as the solution. So even though the whole thing is called Veganism Interactive, it's getting to veganism via speciesism. So these are the reasons why you might want to understand more about veganism, because we inhabit this awful social structure, this violent social structure that's speciesist through and through. And part of what we've been able to do in this animation is make some use of the Donald Watson Archive project, which I'm going to be talking about later with Melda, and some of the historical detail about how the word vegan was created through Donald Watson's writing. So I won't talk any more about that now, but it's kind of cool that we were able to integrate that. And then finally, the most recent thing I've been able to produce is this short documentary film with Hillside Animal Sanctuary, which some of you might know. It's in Norfolk on 2 different sites. It's a fantastic place. And I think it's fair to say to this audience that it's plastered with vegan propaganda, which is kind of really, really cool. So as you go around visiting, encountering some of the animals they look after there, there's lots of posters up explaining some of the harms that they would otherwise be suffering on farms and so forth, which is really amazing. It has a vegan cafe attached to it. Really inspirational place. So in this short documentary, we got to interview some of the people who work there, who tell us some of the individual stories about some of the animals they care for, which really resonated with some of the memes from earlier, for example. So I thought that was super fascinating, how kind of in real life, similar kinds of strategies are being pursued as in the virtual world as well, which is, so in terms of what impact that's having on visitors, that would be something that I think we need to learn more about and research more, and maybe we can at some point, if we're lucky enough to get funding, of course. So yeah, I just wanted to share some of those examples, and I'll hand back over to Mel to finish off.
So my apologies, we have run over slightly and it is lunchtime, but I got the post-lunch slot last time, so this is me getting my revenge by making you wait. So I will wrap this up very quickly, I promise. So we need to think about what is the goal and what do we mean by veganism in order to actually move this forward. So we need to think about where we're coming from in terms of the various different perspectives of animal rights, the anti-speciesism approach, veganism as a lifestyle choice for some people, veganism as an identity, which was raised to me when I did the presentation at the British Society of Criminology conference, and how, therefore, attacks on veganism are attacks on you as an individual. Veganism as a belief system and the sort of human rights implications of that, and relatedly, the veganism as a protected characteristic under the Equality Act as well, all of which could be potential lenses through which we start to think about developing a vegan criminology. As I said, ethical veganism as a moral position can obviously have different ways that plays out for people and different understandings. So we need to think about those different conceptions of vegan ethics. I think the last time I presented here, I said something about animal victimology and vegan ethics. I think it was Josh challenged me about what do you mean by vegan ethics. There's hundreds of them. You need to think about which one you mean. We still haven't talked about it yet, so I need to do that. And to move forward, we need to address a whole bunch of things. I won't reiterate them because they've come up throughout the presentation. But, you know, do we need theories of vegan criminology? Or are we talking about applying existing theories, but through a vegan lens? Is it a subdiscipline? Is it a gathering of individuals? Is there this moral imperative to advocate for non-human animals within our academic work as vegans? The risks of things like silos and tensions amongst people who may have different perspectives. And crucially, I think this idea of do we need a vegan criminology, or as I've mentioned, do we need vegan voices within criminology to try and address some of that? So these are the links if you want to take a picture, and if you want to continue the conversation. Unfortunately, there's no time for any questions, but you're welcome to come and speak to us over lunch, and they're all our email addresses if anybody is interested in asking us more about it, or has an interest in criminology or social harm and might want to be involved in its development. Thank you very much.